Prices went up infamously during the Carter presidency.
Inflation was increasing and unemployment was increasing at the same time.
We are confronted with the problem of inflation.
Inflation is our friend.
Everybody feels very poor.
There's a lot of people that just aren't making it.
It's a tough problem.
The question is, how long will this go on?
The Volcker rule.
Today, I'm going to talk about the cause of the Great Inflation of the 1970s. Let's get started. The Great Inflation was the defining macroeconomic event when the economy changed a lot. It happened in the second half of the 20th century.
Here and now declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
This period, lasting from 1965 to 1982, caused economists to rethink the policies of the Federal Reserve and other central banks. Over the almost 2 decades it lasted, there were 4 economic recessions, 2 severe energy shortages, and the unprecedented peacetime use of wage and price controls after the global monetary system created during World War II was abandoned. It was, according to one prominent economist, the greatest failure of American macroeconomic policy in the post-war period. That failure had a big impact on economic theory and the rules that control money policies at the Federal Reserve and other global central banks. If the Great Inflation was a result of bad American economic policy, then fixing it should be counted as a success. Now, let's go into the forensics of the Great Inflation. In 1964, inflation was about 1% each year. It had been in this range for the previous 6 years. Inflation began to escalate in the mid-1960s and reached more than 14% in 1980. It eventually fell to 3.5% in the latter half of the 1980s. While economists debate the relative importance of the factors that motivated and perpetuated inflation for more than a decade, there is little debate about its source. The Great Inflation was caused by too much money in the economy. The Federal Reserve created this problem by promoting policies that encouraged too much growth in the money supply. This episode of bad economic and monetary policy can be difficult to understand. To make it easier to follow, I will tell the story in 3 parts. This is a forensic examination of the motive, means, and opportunity for the Great Inflation to occur. The motive, the Phillips curve, and the pursuit of full employment. First, just what is the Phillips curve? It's simply an economic concept stating that inflation and unemployment have a stable and inverse relationship. However, the original concept has been disproven by what happened in the 1970s, when there was high inflation and unemployment at the same time.
The unemployment rate soared to 8.2% nationwide last month.
The first portion of the story, the motive underlying the Great Inflation, dates back to the immediate aftermath of the Great Depression, when macroeconomic theory and policy were similarly transformed. After World War II ended, Congress focused on creating policies that it hoped would promote economic stability. The Employment Act of 1946 was one of the most important laws to come out of that time period. Among other things, the act said that it is the responsibility of the federal government to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power, and to make sure that there is better coordination between fiscal and monetary policies. This act, which is often regarded as the father of the Federal Reserve's modern dual mandate, established the Federal Reserve's current 2-part mission: to maintain long-term growth in monetary and credit aggregates, to promote effectively the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. After World War II, many countries followed a policy called Keynesian Stabilization. This policy was motivated by the painful memory of high unemployment rates in the 1930s.
At the consumer level, America may not look much like an economy in distress, but in shops and supermarkets in the residential suburbs, inflation is now beginning to bite hard.
The goal of these regulations was to control how much people spend, known as demand, by managing the government's and central banks' spending and taxation policies, as well as their monetary policies. Today, the notion that monetary policy may and should be used to control aggregate spending and keep the economy on a stable track is still largely accepted. But one critical and erroneous assumption to the implementation of the stabilization policy of the 1960s and 1970s was that there was a stable relationship between unemployment and inflation that could be exploited. Specifically, it was generally believed that permanently lower rates of unemployment could be bought with modestly higher rates of inflation. The idea that the Phillips curve represented a longer-term trade-off between unemployment, which was very harmful to economic well-being, and inflation, which was sometimes perceived as an inconvenience, appealed to policymakers who wanted to implement the Employment Act strictly. However, the stability of the Phillips curve was a dangerous assumption, one that economists Edmund Phelps and Milton Friedman warned about. Said Phelps, if the statical optimum is chosen, it is reasonable to suppose that the participants in product and labor markets will learn to expect inflation. and that, as a consequence of their rational anticipatory behavior, the Phillips curve will gradually shift upward. To summarize, if the Fed wanted to pursue a policy of lower unemployment and more inflation while maintaining price stability, it would be making a false bargain in which inflation must rise ever faster in order to keep up. Now for the means. The collapse of Bretton Woods. Chasing the Phillips curve in pursuit of lower unemployment could not have occurred if the policies of the Federal Reserve were well anchored. And in the 1960s, the US dollar was anchored, albeit very tenuously, to gold through the Bretton Woods Agreement. So the story of the Great Inflation is in part also about the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the separation of the US dollar from its last link to gold. During World War II, the world's industrial nations agreed to a global monetary system that they hoped would bring greater economic stability and peace. This system would promote global trade. That system, which was created by 44 nations in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in July 1944, provided for a fixed rate of exchange between the currencies of the world and the US dollar, and the US dollar was linked to gold. However, the Bretton Woods system had a number of flaws in its implementation. One of the biggest problems was that it tried to keep fixed parity between global currencies, which was incompatible with the domestic economic goals of different countries. As a consequence, many nations were pursuing monetary policies that would move the Phillips curve up and to the right in order to create a more favorable unemployment-inflation link. The United States' status as the world's main currency has presented additional issues. As global trade increased, demand for US dollar reserves increased as well. For a time, the demand for dollars was met by an expanding balance of payments deficit, and foreign central banks amassed more and more dollar reserves. Eventually, the number of dollar reserves held abroad exceeded the U.S. stock of gold, indicating that the United States could not maintain full convertibility at current gold prices, a fact that would not go unnoticed by foreign governments and currency speculators. As inflation increased during the latter part of the 1960s, people started to trade more U.S. dollars for gold. In the summer of 1971, President Nixon stopped this exchange so that the U.S. dollar would not lose its value.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
For the first time in history, the dollar was just a piece of paper, backed only by faith in the Federal Reserve and its policies.
Your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today.
That promise was only as good as the Fed actions behind it. But bowing to pressure from Nixon and clinging to flawed economic theories, the Fed refused to raise rates. Over the next decade, the cost of living more than doubled. The dollar lost more than half its value.
During the next 2 years, there was an effort to salvage the global monetary system through the brief-lived Smithsonian Agreement, but the new arrangement fared no better than Bretton Woods and soon collapsed. The post-war global monetary system was finished. With the final link to gold cut, most of the world's currencies were suddenly and completely unanchored. This was the first time in history that most of the money in the world was on a paper money standard that could not be redeemed for anything valuable. Now for the opportunity: fiscal imbalances, energy shortages, and bad data. The late 1960s and early 1970s were difficult times for the U.S. economy.
Inflation's built severe distortions into the economy. On the industrial front, it's the car manufacturers who've been hardest hit.
President Johnson's Great Society legislation brought about major spending programs across a broad array of social initiatives at a time when the U.S. fiscal situation was already being strained by the Vietnam War. These growing fiscal imbalances make it more difficult to make monetary policy. In order to avoid interfering with the Treasury's funding plans, the Federal Reserve followed a policy of conducting even-keel policies. This meant the central bank would not alter its policy and would not adjust interest rates in the period between the announcement of a Treasury issue and its sale to the market. Under normal circumstances, Treasury issues were rare, and the Fed's even-keel policies had little influence on the implementation of monetary policy. However, as debt problems became more prevalent, the Fed's adherence to the even-keel principle began restricting monetary policy. A more disruptive force was the repeated energy crises that increased oil costs and sapped U.S. growth. The first crisis was an Arab oil embargo that began in October 1973 and went on for about 5 months. During this period, crude oil prices quadrupled.
I've been in 2 gas lines already.
This morning?
This morning.
Why doesn't anybody contact the president? Why is he letting this happen to us?
They reached a plateau that held until the Iranian Revolution brought a second energy crisis in 1979. The second crisis tripled the cost of oil. In the 1970s, economists and policymakers began to understand that there were different types of inflation. This was when they saw the increase in prices across all sectors. Demand and pull inflation was caused by government policies and specifically monetary policy. It resulted from policies that produced a level of spending in excess of what the economy could produce without pushing the economy beyond its ordinary productive capacity and pulling more expensive resources into play. But inflation could also be pushed higher by disruptions in the supply of food and energy. This cost-push inflation also got passed through the chain of production into higher retail prices. From the viewpoint of the central bank, the increasing cost of oil was largely out of its hands. But the increase in unemployment that was occurring in response to the jump in oil prices was not. The Federal Reserve responded to a mandate to establish full employment with little or no reserve management anchor by allowing huge and growing fiscal imbalances and fighting against the energy-related headwinds. These policies accelerated the amount of money in the economy and raised prices without reducing unemployment.
And Arthur Burns, chairman of the Fed, he did not do what a good central banker should do and raise rates to break the inflation. And by the time the 70s ended, it was a total mess.
Bad data, or at least a bad understanding of the data, also handicapped policymakers. They made decisions based on inaccurate information which resulted in them making poor choices. Looking back at the information policymakers had in hand during the period leading up to and during the Great Inflation, economist Athanasios Orphanides has shown that the real-time estimate of potential output was significantly overstated, and the estimate of the rate of unemployment consistent with full employment was significantly understated. In other words, policymakers were likely underestimating the inflationary effects of their policies. In fact, without increasing inflation, the policy path they were on was simply untenable. But wait, there's more. The Phillips curve, which was a crucial reference for Federal Reserve policy decisions, began to shift. And finally, from high inflation to inflation targeting, the conquest of U.S. inflation. The stable trade-off between inflation and unemployment turned out to be unstable, as Phelps and Friedman correctly predicted. The ability of policymakers to control any real variable was not permanent. This truth included the rate of unemployment, which oscillated around its natural rate. The policymakers hoped to find a trade-off, but it did not exist. As businesses and households came to appreciate, indeed anticipate, rising prices, any trade-off between inflation and unemployment became a less favorable exchange until, in time, unemployment became unacceptably high. This became the era of stagflation. In 1964, when this story began, the inflation rate was 1% and the unemployment rate was 5%. 10 years later, inflation would be more than 12% and unemployment would be more than 7%. By the summer of 1980, inflation was approaching 14.5% and unemployment was over 7.5%. Federal Reserve officials were not blind to the inflation that was occurring and were well aware of their two goals: to achieve full employment and price stability. The Employment Act of 1946 was recodified in 1978 by the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act, commonly known as the Humphrey-Hawkins Act after the bill's sponsors. Humphrey-Hawkins charges the Federal Reserve to pursue full employment and price stability. The central bank must also set targets for different monetary aggregates and provide a semi-annual monetary policy report to Congress. Despite this, the employment half of the mandate appeared to be more important when there was a conflict between full employment and inflation. As Fed Chairman Arthur Burns would later claim, full employment was the primary objective in the public's and government's eyes, if not also in those of the Federal Reserve. However, it was also clear that trying to solve the inflation problem would have been too costly for the economy and jobs. There have been a few previous attempts to reduce inflation without the additional burden of higher unemployment. The Nixon administration put in place wage and price controls in 3 different phases between 1971 and 1974. The controls only temporarily slowed the rise in prices.
However, I hope that independently he will conclude that my views are the ones that should be followed.
This made the shortages worse, especially for food and energy. The Ford administration had no better luck when they tried to control inflation. After declaring inflation enemy number 1.
The tyranny of double-digit inflation is our common enemy in 1974.
The president in 1974 introduced the Whip Inflation Now program. This voluntary program had measures to encourage people to save more money, but it failed. By the late 1970s, the general public had come to expect an inflationary bias in monetary policy, and they were increasingly unhappy with inflation. Many surveys showed that the public lost confidence in the economy and government policy during the second half of the 1970s, and often inflation was identified as a special evil. Interest rates appeared to be on a secular rise since 1965 and spiked sharply higher still as the 1970s came to a close. During this time, business investment slowed down and productivity weakened. The nation's trade balance with other countries worsened, and inflation was seen as a major cause of the economic problems or the main reason for them. But once policymakers found themselves in a position with high inflation and high unemployment, they faced an unhappy dilemma. It is very difficult to fight high unemployment and inflation at the same time. If you try to fight high inflation, it could cause the unemployment rate to go up. In 1979, Paul Volcker, who had previously served as the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, was named chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. When he took office in August, the inflation rate year over year was more than 11% and the unemployment rate was close to 6%. By this time, it was generally accepted that reducing inflation requires controlling the growth rate of reserves and money in general. The Federal Open Market Committee had already started to set goals for how much money should be in the economy. This is required by a law called the Humphrey-Hawkins Act. However, it was clear that sentiment was changing with the new chairman, and that stronger measures to control the growth of the money supply were required. In October 1979, the Federal Open Market Committee announced that it would target reserve growth instead of the Fed funds rate as its policy instrument. Even if it had the effect of temporarily disrupting economic activity and, for a time, increasing joblessness, inflation was now seen as essential to both aims of the dual mandate. In early 1980, Volcker said, "My basic philosophy is over time we have no choice but to deal with the inflationary situation because over time inflation and the unemployment rate go together."
Volcker had tried to get the Fed governors to nudge interest rates upward, without success. So he tried a different tack, persuading them to focus on controlling the money supply. It was a sleight of hand, because the two are essentially the same. But it was a politically palatable tactic, and it worked.
And when he slowed the money growth rate, predictably, the interest rate went way up.
Over time, the desired slowing of inflation was achieved by having greater control over reserve and money growth. Although this was not perfect, it worked well enough. This tighter reserve management was made stricter with the introduction of credit controls in early 1980 and with the Monetary Control Act. Interest rates changed a lot in 1980. They went up, then down for a bit, and then went back up again. Lending activity fell, unemployment rose, and the economy went into a brief recession between January and July. Inflation fell but was still high even as the economy recovered in the second half of 1980. However, the Volcker Fed continued to fight high inflation with a combination of higher interest rates and slower reserve growth. In July 1981, the economy fell into a recession again, which proved to be more severe and drawn out than the previous one. Unemployment peaked at nearly 11%, but inflation continued to move lower, and by the recession's end, year-over-year inflation was back under 5%. In time, the Fed's commitment to low inflation gained credibility and unemployment dropped as a result of strong economic growth. The Great Inflation was over.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that was a difficult time.
By this time, the macroeconomic theory had changed dramatically as a result of the economic lessons of the era. In macroeconomic models, the essential function that public expectations play in the link between economic policy and economic performance has become standard practice, making time-consistent policy choices that don't sacrifice long-term prosperity for short-term gains, and having policy credibility are important for good macroeconomic results. Today, central banks understand that a commitment to price stability is essential for good monetary policy. Most central banks, including the Federal Reserve, have adopted specific numerical objectives for inflation. These numerical inflation targets have helped to control inflation by providing an anchor for monetary policy, and in so doing, they have also increased transparency and reduced uncertainty, now recognized to be critical prerequisites for long-term development and maximum employment. So, what can we learn from the Great Inflation of the 1970s? For one, it's a reminder that economic policies have real-world consequences. It also underscores the importance of keeping an eye on inflation and all other economic indicators to avoid nasty surprises down the road. Finally, it serves as a cautionary tale about giving central bankers too much power, something we should bear in mind as we watch current events unfold here at home.